Have you ever seen an old photo or a film still that gave you a deep sense of longing or yearning? Some people will call that nostalgia, but if it's from a time period before you were even born, what you're actually experiencing is anemoia, the concept of being nostalgic for a time period you never experienced. Digicams have seen a resurgence over the past 2 years, and I can see why. They're cheap and they're fun. But I think the biggest reason why they're popular again is due to anemoia. Gen Z's fascination of the digicam is a rejection of smartphone culture and an idealization of the 2000s decade. A couple months ago, I was shooting a Y2K themed nightclub event. It was pretty fun, but I was definitely the oldest person in the room. The club was full of like 18, 19-year-olds wearing baggy pants and carrying digicams. I was instantly transported back to 2005. It was kind of surreal. As someone born in the 90s, I'm old enough to remember the 2000s, and this whole Y2K, McBling, emo, MySpace revival is the first time that I'm witnessing pop culture go through the 20-year cycle in real time. Makes me feel old as shit, but objectively, it's pretty fascinating to watch a younger generation romanticize the stuff that I grew up on. After that event, I was inspired to go out and buy a digicam for myself. And if you don't already own one, I recommend it. I love the tactile feel of physical buttons. There's a rawness and simplicity to digicams that you just don't get with iPhones or high-powered modern-day cameras. Over the past 3 years, iPhone cameras have gotten to a point where they're too overproduced now. The obsession with hyper-polished, smooth images has gone too far in my opinion. Now they're uncanny and too perfect, and perfection isn't how we experience real life. On the other hand, digicams, for all their flaws, the low megapixels and the graininess, are in some ways more authentic than the AI-filtered iPhone photos of today because they attempt to replicate reality as accurately as possible. Every time you take an iPhone photo of a sunset, there's an algorithm working behind the scenes that artificially adds saturation and texture to make the image more vivid. And while it makes for a pretty picture, a lot of what you end up seeing is just pure software fabrication. When you take photos of people, pay close attention. You'll notice that faces brighten up and distort in places where they shouldn't be. To most people, it's not a big deal. Some prefer it. But personally, I appreciate the honesty and grittiness of old technology, and using these vintage cameras takes me back to a simpler time before our lives were consumed with screens 24/7. When we weren't so chronically online and our attention spans were still somewhat intact. The feeling of nostalgia is really powerful in my opinion, and its fingerprints are marked all over my work. On the other hand, you should always be suspicious of nostalgia. Every time your brain tries to access a memory, it's impossible to recall every detail, so instead, your brain fills in the blanks with fiction, kind of like its own version of generative fill. Because of this, I'm of the belief there is no such thing as the good old days. Whether you're thinking back on your college days, your time in high school, or even looking back on childhood, if you think hard enough, they were never as perfect as you remember them to be. Nostalgia is a never-ending illusion. The most extreme form is anemoia, the concept of being nostalgic for a time you've never known. For me, growing up in the 2000s, I felt anemoia for the early 90s and wished so badly that I could have been a teenager during this era. The people looked so much cooler, the sky looked more blue, and the music spoke to me in a way that Chingy or Lil Jon couldn't. I would spend entire days listening to albums and reading about the 90s on Wikipedia. I was the epitome of, I was born in the wrong generation. Combining the images and movies I'd watched, I'd constructed this perfect fantasy version of the early 90s. But as an adult now, I can see I probably would have hated it. I would have been so bored, and my opportunities in life would have been much more limited. And as we know now, there's a lot going behind the scenes that we weren't aware of. There wasn't even internet back then. I mean, there was, but it was all text-based. I wouldn't have access to the same resources I had growing up. Video games weren't as good as they would be in following years. Comedy was very basic. You know, like the idea of irony and meta humor just wasn't as refined. Like back then, I feel like the height of comedy was Jim Carrey making a quirky face. Kind of basic in my opinion. And just in general, the world was a much more isolating and less connected place. And tying it all back to the whole digicam thing, it's clear to me that Gen Z's fascination of the digicam is that it represents this idealization of the 2000s. As a younger millennial, or zillennial, it's really interesting to see things come full circle and watch Gen Z idealize the early 2000s, My childhood, the way that I did with the early 90s. I see it in the way young people dress now. Skinny jeans are out, baggy pants are in, minimalist design replaced by maximalism. For most people, the whole Y2K revival is nothing more than just a fun aesthetic choice. It ain't that deep. But for some people, I think they actually believe that the 2000s was this utopia. Take it from me, the 2000s sucked just as much as any other decade. People always complain about war, that the economy is bad, and that the youth is being corrupted. It's just the same talking points with a remix. Looking back, we have the luxury of cherry-picking some of the best art and media of the time, otherwise known as survivorship bias. Old heads, when reminiscing, conveniently forget all the mediocre things about the 2000s. For every rapper like Andre 3000, there was the Laffy Taffy and Insane Clown Posse. For every band like The Strokes, there were a dozen other generic bands that followed. And not to get all woke, but the amount of ignorance that was normalized in the 2000s is kind of trippy to think about in hindsight. Things like racism, sexism, and homophobia was just the de facto way of life. And not even like a funny, ironic 4chan edgelord kind of way. I mean, like, people would just bash gay people because they didn't like them. Minority groups weren't represented with any depth or given a platform to share their stories. They were just relegated to punchlines and one-dimensional gags because media gatekeepers at the time didn't see them as marketable enough. It's why Ricky Martin didn't come out the closet till the following decade. Another perfect example was when they decided to make a live-action Dragon Ball movie in 2009. I'd spent my entire childhood watching Dragon Ball Z, one of the only representations of Asians that was actually cool. Then they made that motherfucker white. Bruh. The last thing I want to mention, and something that people romanticize the most about the 2000s, is the lack of social media being a constant presence in our life. I get that it's bad for our mental health, with phone addiction and the whole chasing likes for validation, but here's a hot take. I love late-stage social media. It's got some of the most bizarre and layered pieces of media. Like, you could not explain why these TikToks are so funny to a human being in 2005. They're just so complex and absurd for someone from the 2000s to understand. Late-stage social media also removed the gatekeepers of art and media. It used to be a small group of old white people determined who would be successful in art or not. But now, with social media, anyone can gain an online audience. In a lot of ways, I'm actually jealous of Gen Z and Gen Alpha because you guys were born into the tech infrastructure to be able to take your passions and make a living off them as content creators. That path was laid out for you since day one. I wasted so much money going to college. If I was born in 2009, I could have been doing exactly what I'm doing now, just without all the student debt. Anyway, I'm not trying to shit on the 2000s. Like, that decade, I have a lot of great memories from it. All I'm saying is that I think there's a way to enjoy old technology without getting sucked into the illusion of nostalgia. These old devices used today can bridge the present with the past. This lets you enjoy the best of both worlds. When I was 20 years old, I dated a 31-year-old woman, and weirdly enough, we were able to connect on a deep level. She was surprised by my knowledge of history and 90s movies and music. I told her how I was jealous that she got to grow up in that time, and what she told me actually kind of shocked me. She said the 90s I was thinking of only existed in movies. And funny enough, I met a girl at that Y2K event I mentioned at the start of this video, and I found myself in a bizarrely similar situation. Except this time, I was the older person, and she was the 20-year-old fascinated by the early 2000s. And I told her what that older woman told me. The 2000s she was thinking of only existed in movies. And that's a never-ending loop of nostalgia. Same shit, different decade. Whatever's popular now is going to be uncool in 5 to 10 years' time, but if you just wait 20 years' time, it'll all come back in style. Same thing happened to film cameras. Now it's happening to digicams. So my advice is keep all your iPhones, your iPads, your mirrorless cameras, because by the year 2040, when Gen Alphas are all adults, you can sell it back to them, mark up the price, and make a pretty solid profit off their nostalgia. Thanks for watching. Peace. Oh, and also follow my Instagram, Silvestre_3000. Peace.